Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers and I'm delighted to be joined this week as ever by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we also have Spiked columnist, Luke Gittos.
Hi.
So we've got plenty to discuss today. First of all, Telegram, Facebook and the fight for free speech online, the return of Islamist terror to Europe, and why things won't be getting any better under Labour. So the founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, was arrested last week. This week, he was given a long list of charges, all connected to things that he is alleged to have allowed to happen on his app. Tom, this is a completely unprecedented move. Normally, it's taken as a given that apps like WhatsApp or Facebook will, unfortunately, pay host to criminal activity. And never before has Mark Zuckerberg been arrested or Elon Musk been put in handcuffs. This is quite an extraordinary move on the part of the French.
It definitely feels like a kind of escalation in the growing battle that we've been seeing between the big tech companies and various governments, particularly in Europe. And as you say, just holding the CEO of a company to account, there's various charges, things in relation to terrorism, relation to child exploitation, basically saying that because these nefarious individuals use this tool in the same way they might use a telephone or an internet connection, that therefore this company and this individual, Pavel Durov, is in some ways culpable for that, is really alarming. And I think it's a sign of things to come, really. I think there's been a growing hostility towards the social media companies, particularly ones like Telegram, which prize themselves on being basically as censorship free as is possible while still maintaining a reasonable business. And there's a kind of sense of tightening of the screws. I mean, Macron has been very keen to present this as nothing to do with the government. He's obviously very keen to maintain Paris's sort of status as a would-be hub for tech startups and so on. But I think it's undeniable that this is the culmination, really, of where a lot of things have been, a culmination of where things have been going in Europe, not just in France, but across the EU, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, look, it does sort of fit into that broader sort of anti-free speech, trend that we've been seeing lately.
The first thing I've been struck by is how people have described this as reigniting a debate around free speech. Well, this doesn't feel like a debate. It feels like something far more serious. When people are being arrested in Europe and across this country for what they say online, it does feel like we're moving into different territory. And to talk about this as though it's a very nice discussion around the limits of freedom of speech when Pavel Durov has been arrested on very, very serious charges seems a little understated. I mean, what people might not know about Pavel Durov is that he was at the center of, at least in the minds of the Kremlin, of the anti-Kremlin movement for a long time. He was his platform, his old platform, BK, was central to opposition movements against the Kremlin, including in Ukraine in the Maidan. And at that time, if you listen to his interviews, he describes how he resisted calls from the Russian government to hand over details for, say, Ukrainian opposition within that movement, and said, we're not going to compromise our users in order to satisfy the Kremlin. So he has always been, we should take anything he says in interviews, I suppose, with a pinch of salt, but he has been a central figure in a kind of anti-establishment in anti-establishment movements before. So his arrest is really frightening, because if it's now the case that owners of these networks can be held accountable for what is said on them, then inevitably the natural reaction on behalf of those owners is going to be clamped down on what is said and what is permissible. And that sets a terrifying precedent, I think. One thing he also talked about was how this is about regulation, and it's a discussion around how he responds to various requests for information from different national states. So he talked about how he was asked for information around the January 6th riots and refused, claiming that this was a political move. And you can see how these requests for information against companies like Telegram can be used politically. I'm not suggesting that has been done, but you can see the potential for states to take action in a quite a politicized way in order to get information about how political movements are developing. So you don't need to be conspiratorial to think that once the governments and states have a way to find this information out, and once that pressure is applied, it's going to be applied for reasons that we might not think acceptable.
Yeah, and it's interesting, bringing up his past with the Russian government. Similarly, Telegram's been hailed by the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong as absolutely essential to them organising. We seem to understand instinctively that why he would not want to give up information to the CCP or to Putin and the Kremlin. But as soon as it's our governments, we sort of assume that, well, they can't possibly have any nefarious reasons to want someone's information. But that's not the case, is it?
And you can also clearly see that the bulk of the allegations, which basically relate to illegal activity, it's not necessarily a pure speech issue, are being treated as the kind of thin end of the wedge. I mean, a lot of the chatter around this is a lot of the commentary is suggesting, maybe this will be good because it will bring the tech bros kind of down to size, and therefore they're more likely to acquiesce to something like the European Digital Services Act or to any of these attempts by various governments to clamp down not on illegal activity that has takes place online, but just on speech, which they would rather wasn't uttered. And that's been really explicit. And I think there's a reason actually that we're starting to see a bit of a shift in relation to Silicon Valley. I mean, we might go on to Mark Zuckerberg's comments this week, but how I think they're starting to realize that whilst, with the exception of a platform like Telegram, with the exception of the new X under Elon Musk, a lot of these social media companies have played ball with various governments for quite a long time. I think what they're finally starting to realize is that none of it will ever be enough. And I think this case in particular will be a bit of a wake-up call for some of those companies, some of those tech bros, that going along with this stuff won't necessarily save you in the long term, depending on who's in government and what axe they have to grind at any particular time.
Yeah, that's right. And we should talk a bit about what Mark Zuckerberg said recently. He sort of gave a semi-apology for his quite extensive use of censorship during the COVID pandemic, particularly when the Biden administration arrived on the scene. They were constantly making requests to take down things that they considered to be misinformation, sometimes things that were satirical. I mean, we've spoken about that stuff kind of endlessly, but it's interesting to have Mark Zuckerberg admit to it in a way, because we've been told that this wasn't happening for so long.
Yeah, and his apology also included reference to the Hunter Biden story, which Facebook demoted as not newsworthy, remarkably, and on the basis that it was disinformation. And of course, it transpired that it wasn't disinformation. It was a worthwhile story that ought to have been reported. I do think that this the discussion around disinformation shows us how that the term can be used in a political way. And I think that Zuckerberg's response and his apparent mea culpa, obviously comes too late, because the flow of information around COVID was so important to open debate around how we responded to that moment. And what COVID did is, I think, set a precedent. And the precedent was that in some limited way, even, that the authorities can control what we do and don't say. And it's worth noting that the US government were completely unapologetic around attempting to compel Facebook to censor particular material. There hasn't been any mea culpa on their part in relation to the Hunter Biden story. So they seem completely unapologetic about controlling the way that Facebook allows us to receive information. And I think my worry is that what we've seen in the aftermath of COVID is a more creeping acceptance of the criminal law to regulate what we say. It just seems that is gradually gathering momentum now in a way which we haven't seen previously. We covered on Spiked, thousands of people are being arrested every year for what they say. Yeah, we have normalized the fact that the police can show up and arrest you for something that you post online, and that seems this seems to be the apex of what we're experiencing.
Definitely, Tom, do you want to comment on that?
No, I also think that the Facebook example is a reminder of how the relationship between government and social media companies became very blurry, I think, during the pandemic, certainly, which is that even in America, bound by the First Amendment and so on, where it would be incredibly difficult to have any kind of legal mechanism by which you could force social media companies to crack down on speech and so on. There was this hand-in-glove arrangement where you basically had either discussions going on in private or a lot of browbeating in public to try and force the tech platforms to crack down on certain forms of speech that the government didn't like. It was essentially like outsourcing state censorship to the private sector in an instance where state censorship, because of the First Amendment, isn't allowed. And it's a reminder that despite Zuckerberg's mea culpa, he was a pretty willing participant of this for quite a long time. I mean, right at the beginning of the pandemic, Facebook started clamping down on various forms of misinformation as its, know-nothing moderators saw it. He was even deleting, not him personally, his company was even deleting event pages for anti-lockdown protests on the grounds that they would break local social distancing rules, which really raised a lot of tricky questions. And then by the time of about 2021, when the Biden administration comes in, Robbie Suave from Reason got his hands on loads of internal emails between Meta and the CDC, to the point where at one point they were basically just sending various claims and trending topics and so on to the CDC to vet them. They were referring to them as their colleagues, thanking them for helping them with the debunking and so on. It was very chummy what was going on. But going to that point I made earlier, I think what he and others have started to realise that it was never enough. During this time, you still had Biden giving press conferences saying Facebook is killing people. You had his Surgeon General suggesting that more had to be done on the legal front to make them play ball. They would always kind of brandish the possibility of their companies being broken up or them taking away their rights under Section 230, which protects them from liability for what their users say on their platforms. So I think a lot of these tech companies, they're quite unprincipled. They're led by people who primarily just want to make money. But what has happened over the years is that they have succumbed to pressure either from governments or just from the great and good to censor more and more categories of speech, more and more individuals. And I think now the penny is starting to drop that they've really got nothing out of this. It hasn't made the problem go away. If anything, it's made the demands on them even louder and more extensive, it seems like.
Definitely. And it is just worth underscoring that, the reason this is a problem, or the reason holding companies like Facebook liable for the content they post, is not because we care particularly about the fate of Mark Zuckerberg or his monopoly over social media. It's because it will in turn it will come for us. It means that we will be limited on what we can say on those platforms. That's the real crux of the matter that is often missed in the debate around big tech versus government regulation. It's us who are the objects of regulation, the users, not Mark Zuckerberg, really.
Yeah, because they dress it up as we're coming after those people. That's not what it's about, as you say. And also, it's a reminder that we're basically in a situation where the extent of freedom of speech online, because it is so monopolized by a handful of companies, is basically reliant on the whims of a handful of billionaires. X happens to be in the hands of one who's pretty solid on these issues, Facebook less so. That shouldn't be what determines how free you are to speak your mind on the internet, but that is the state of affairs that we have.
If you're as busy as I am, then staying healthy can sometimes feel like a real chore. I mean, who really has the time to prepare 10 different salads for lunch? Or to keep track of all the supplements you're supposed to take with every meal? Well, to keep things simple, I've started drinking AG1. AG1 is by far the most convenient daily nutrition supplement out there. Just one scoop contains 70 high-quality ingredients, all designed to meet your baseline nutritional needs. Lately, I've loved kicking off the day with AG1 alongside my usual morning coffee. All I need to do is mix one scoop of AG1 with water, and I'm all set. It literally takes less than a minute. AG1 provides me with all the minerals and vitamins I need to keep me sharp and focused throughout the day. AG1 releases energy in a slow and sustained way, so I don't have to worry about crashing midday, like you do if you have too much caffeine. Personally, my favourite thing about AG1 is that it massively cuts down my stress levels. My days are generally very busy, but thanks to AG1, my mood is always even. AG1 keeps me clear-headed and alert, even when life gets hectic. I have complete confidence in AG1. All of its high-quality ingredients are rigorously tested and verified, so you can rest assured that you'll get exactly what's said on the label, and that all of it is good for you. So, if you want to take ownership of your health in the easiest way possible, try AG1 today and get a free 1-year supplement of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. The West German town of Solingen was rocked by a deadly Islamist attack last week. 3 people were killed and 8 people were injured in a knifing spree. IS, Islamic State, have claimed responsibility for this. It was happening during a festival of diversity, celebrating the town's 650th anniversary. Tom, I mean, what have you made of this? It feels like Islamist terror is making a return to Europe, but it's as if it doesn't seem to puncture the front pages for very long.
And it hasn't really gone away either. I think that's something that's worth stressing, because this attack feels in many respects like the culmination of something that was coming in Germany, but also across Europe for some time now. I mean, there was this attack. There was also, of course, the Mannheim stabbing in Germany back in May, I believe, where someone stabbed. There was a multiple stabbing at a kind of anti-Islam rally, ended up leading to the death of one police officer and the injury of many more, believed to have an Islamist motivation. But there's also been a string of foiled plots.
Yeah.
Many of them ISIS-linked or Hamas-linked. There was a Hamas-linked plot back in December, which was foiled in Germany. Since then, there's been a string of cases which haven't made the news over here, but a group of teenagers who were found to be kind of plotting attacks on churches and so on, having amongst themselves pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. There was a case of a plot believed to be against the Swedish parliament, which was going to be hatched from Germany, which was foiled. There was an individual, I believe from Iraq, who was believed to basically be awaiting his orders, willing to carry out ISIS-linked plots and so on. So there's been this whole string of these, which haven't made the news over here, but obviously have been creating this drumbeat towards what we saw over the past week in Solingen. There was another plot as well during the Euros, which was foiled just before the England and Spain final. So this is something which there's a depressing inevitability towards all of it. But what is also depressing is the fact that we now treat these attacks like it's sort of just bad weather, like it flares up from time to time, but there's not much that can really be done about it. I think we really need to drop that, not least because I think it lets the government off the hook for the role they've played in failing to keep people safe and for maintaining policies which have raised the likelihood that something like this could happen, not least because in this case, this was a Syrian asylum seeker who should have been deported but wasn't. So all of these questions are raised by this. And to just dismiss it as, well, it's going to happen from time to time seems to let a lot of people off the hook.
Yeah, he basically managed to stay for long enough that his deportation order expired, which is pretty shocking.
And he wasn't at his refugee accommodation when they turned up to get him. That seems to me too easy a loophole to exploit, I dare say.
And that's therefore the end of the matter. Yeah, it is extraordinary. And what continually shocks me, and perhaps it shouldn't, is the unwillingness of the establishment across Europe to confront Islamism as an ideological threat. I mean, it was striking that actually when the German coalition came to power a couple of years ago, it actually disbanded a working group on Islamism and replaced it with a working group on Islamophobia. And it feels like that sort of encapsulates exactly the problem here. There's just a real cowardice around this issue. As you say, Tom, we treat it as a problem of bad weather, or perhaps it's a technical problem. The German government is currently going after knives, seeing that, knife ownership is the big problem. Okay, I'm not in favor of people owning knives, but that clearly isn't what motivated this attack. Solingen, ironically, is known for manufacturing knives. It's called in Germany the City of Blades. It hasn't had a terror attack like this in its 650 years of existence. It's the Islamist factor that has made this happen. Luke, what do you make of that sort of cowardice in the face of Islamist terror?
Yeah, I think cowardice is the right word. I mean, we didn't mention the Taylor Swift concerts that were cancelled, and the details that are emerging about that plot seem absolutely unbelievable. That they were targeting tens of thousands of people, intending to kill many thousands of young people at a pop concert, something we've seen, in this country as well. And so we don't seem willing to talk about the absolute barbarism that's sitting under the surface in Europe. And I'll just mention the riots quickly, because I do think that was a remarkable moment where in the immediate aftermath of what we knew about the Southport stabbings, which was that young children, young girls had been targeted at a Taylor Swift dance class, people suddenly believed that this was an Islamist attack. And everyone said, this is only the result of misinformation online. And for me, that was a really interesting moment, because the real question is, why did people believe that? And the people believed that because it looked exactly like an Islamist attack. We know now that it has nothing to do with Islam, but it looked like an Islamist attack. And I think that's what we're failing to grapple with, is the fact that people are so frustrated about the failure to look this problem in the face. And I think that's where some of the anger around the riots come from, not to legitimize them in any way at all. But I think there was a moment where the idea that this was simply misinformation that sparked these riots, that had simply no basis in reality. I think that was an interesting moment that highlighted our unwillingness to say that this did look like an Islamist attack. It did look like a lot of the other attacks that have happened in this country and abroad, which were directly connected to Islamism. So I do think there needs to be a reckoning. I don't know what that reckoning looks like. It's about recognizing Islamism in the different forms that it arises. It's not just in the form of terror attacks, but it does take the form of anti-Israel protests that we've seen in this country. We've seen Islamist sentiment expressed on those marches, the idea that we should remove Israel from the map, from the river to the sea, etc. These are all, disturbances outside primary schools when particular lessons have been taught. The Batley Grammar School, all of these instances seem to just come and go, and we seem to just live with them. And until we have some kind of public discussion around how we respond to that ideological threat, I think we're in a very dangerous place indeed.
Definitely. Tom?
And I think part of the what makes this so shocking is because of the fact that we're now getting into the period where it's just explicitly downplayed. And I think the riots, for all the horrendous things that came out of that, has also provided a pretext through which the Islamist problem can be downplayed, despite the fact, as we talked about on the show last week. I mean, to suggest that the majority of the threat comes from Islamism is to almost understate it. I mean, it's overwhelming if you look at certainly the body count, certainly the amount of MI5 caseload, which is concerned with Islamist terrorism versus any other variety of it. And I think now that's what we're going to see. We're going to see long, kind of ponderous discussions that we saw from Keir Starmer this week about the threat from the far right and so on. All the while, this other form of the far right, if you want to say it, certainly its most lethal form on Britain's streets in the 21st century, is going to be completely ignored. And also, I think a lot of the tricky questions are going to be ignored around the fact that whilst there has been at least some discussion about the kind of homegrown terrorism component and the way in which that people even brought up in Western societies grow to loathe them and hate them, there is also this security question around borders, because we have seen a string of attacks of relatively recent arrivals. And there was even, everyone's forgotten about this now, but the terror attack in last October in Hartlepool, where you had a gentleman, I believe, who had been kind of floating around Europe, being denied asylum everywhere he went, ends up in Britain, and is in refugee accommodation, becomes obsessed with Hamas on October 7th, and ends up stabbing one of his housemates to death, himself a refugee and asylum seeker. This isn't just a threat to people who are already living in this country, because he'd converted to Christianity and he wasn't too happy with that. And then he went out into the street and stabbed a man to death. Everyone's forgotten about that case completely. We weren't allowed to report it at the time. It was all shrouded in mystery. It's only recently kind of made its way through the courts and been clear that it's was terror. It was actually branded a terrorist crime. But there's been no discussion about that whatsoever. And I dare say that's going to be the pattern that's going to be repeated in the years to come.
So Sir Keir Starmer delivered a rather grim State of the Nation speech earlier this week. He warned that things are now so bad that they can only get worse before they get better. Notably, he also said that there was not just a fiscal black hole in terms of the public finances, but also a social black hole. And he blamed the Conservative government for creating that, and also for their snake oil populism, which he blamed for fueling the riots. Luke, was anything in particular in that speech that caught your eye?
Lots of clanging metaphors. And I think the first thing to say about it is what's been very interesting about Keir Starmer's programme so far is this attempt to depoliticise his own programme. So at every turn, every minister announcing any policy has said, this is what we have to do.
Yeah.
And we have to do it because the prisons are full, so we have to let people out early. There's a black hole. We have to raise capital gains tax or whatever they're going to announce, or raise fuel duty or whatever they're going to do. The point is that they're depoliticising their own approach. So they're saying, this is the only way we can get through this. It's going to be painful, sort of like a doctor performing an operation. You know, this is something that's got to happen. We're going to pull your teeth out, but it's going to be better afterwards. And I think that distancing themselves from politics has been really interesting, because Keir Starmer is not a politician. He's not a leader. He's a lawyer. He's someone who can craft communication quite well, but it's all very technocratic. And actually, you have seen in these first few months real political decisions being taken by this Labour government, ending the winter fuel allowance, which has caused consternation and anger across the country, public pay increases in face of the trade unions that's made people angry. And these are political decisions, but they're being dressed up as technocratic ones, and ones which we have no control over. We have to get things working again. It's all very technocratic and legal. He's going to have to move on from that at some point, and be honest with the public that there are political decisions being taken, and he's going to have to come forward with some kind of political justification for what he's doing, because otherwise he's not a politician, he's just a manager.
Tom, what have you made of it?
No, it does feel like we're very much trapped in that kind of politics of there is no alternative, and even it's even become more unimpressive in the new forms that it comes in. I mean, it feels like we've had a series of kind of political tribute acts. So you had New Labour, then you had Cameron as the kind of heir to Blair. Now, if you look at some of the reporting around the way in which Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are trying to frame the politics of this, they're explicitly lifting it from the coalition, the way in which they very effectively managed to pin all of their economic decisions as the inevitable consequence of Labour not leaving any money in the coffers, effectively. They're completely aping that argument, that style. And if anything, doing it worse, oddly. I thought it's fascinating to do it. To call a speech, I mean, for someone who's so terrible at public speaking, he gives a lot of speeches, Keir Starmer, it's not a combination. But to call a speech in which the top line of it is essentially things are going to get worse, is even on a kind of superficial political messaging level is so incredibly inept, as well as terribly uninspiring, gives you no sense that he's got any sense of how to get us out of the much deeper economic hole that we're in that even he doesn't necessarily want to admit to. But it's interesting, but not at all surprising that the wheels are kind of starting to come off, or at least start to shake a little bit, very, very quickly. I mean, his approval rating has plunged. I mean, currently the proportion of the country who believe that the government are doing, on balance, a good job is only, I think, slightly below or is it only slightly higher where Theresa May was at the same point in her premiership after she'd lost the 2017 election. Well, not lost the election, but lost her majority in that election. So it's a kind of reminder that this very short-lived enthusiasm we saw amongst the commentariat in the wake of the election, the way in which people were talking about, 34% of the vote with low turnout, translated about 20% of the country, that this was a transformative, exciting, wonderful government that was going to right all the wrongs of the previous 14 years. It's just collided with reality very quickly, I think.
I hope we're not going to see any more of those sort of sexy Starmer type.
Is Catamaran still aroused? That's the question.
One of the big political choices Starmer has made, or he's confirmed based on a few leaks, is that they're going to ban smoking outdoors. Now, that does, again, this is posed as something technocratic. It's something we have to do for the health of the nation. But really, it betrays their politics, right? I mean, Starmer is miserable. He is authoritarian. He is Puritan, and all of those things.
You're quite. I mean, who knows how this is going to work? I mean, this comes off the back of the Tories' failed attempt to ban smoking generationally. You remember one of their last policies was to phase out smoking by making it illegal for people before this date to buy cigarettes, people after that date to buy cigarettes, and that turned out to be a complete mess. This looks at least as though it resembles the smoking ban of the past. They're just moving it outdoors. But again, the problem is how do you stop someone smoking outside? Do you seriously walk up and give them a fine, give them a ticket or whatever? But you're right. I mean, this is an impulsive move to do something about public health, which just involves taking away someone's freedom. And when governments want to do something about a perceived problem like public health, banning is always the easiest thing to do. Just extend a ban, make something more illegal, and it's thought that will solve the problem. I mean, I do think that it's incredibly authoritarian, and especially the way, again, that these sort of things become normalized. We remember the discussions around the indoor smoking ban.
Yeah.
And people, we a lot of people say, well, we look back at that now and what a sensible choice we all made. Wasn't that a wonderful thing to do? But it did lead to significant closures of venues up and down the country. It led to people losing their jobs. It led to a very significant change in our culture. And what's being proposed now would mean the closure of shisha bars, who would no longer be able to have shisha outside. It would mean the infrastructure that was built up around COVID, people building things outside so people could be outside, would now be redundant.
Yeah.
It's huge economic cost, and it's another state, and it's another move which shows complete indifference to business owners who have attempted to go along with the mad rules that have been up and down since COVID. It's just another two fingers to them.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember when Blair wanted to create a European-style cafe culture? Those were the days of...
Finally, it's happened.
Yeah. I don't normally look back fondly on the new Labour years as, bastions of liberty, but there you go.
It's worth remembering as well that as part... I believe this is going to be part of their kind of revived tobacco and vapes bill, which was supposed to be Rishi Sunak's legacy. And then because the election he himself calls and ends up nixing his supposed legacy policy and handing it to the Labour Party. But I believe the generational ban is almost certainly also going to be a part of that. They're going to revive that. That's one thing to watch out for, I think. But because that plan to raise the smoking age by 1 year every year until no one can smoke, it's so demented in terms of how do you possibly police that I think the next move will just be to say we just need to ban it for everyone. Yeah. But this is also a reminder that at least part of the deal when it was first raised by the Tories was existing smokers are going to kind of be left alone. But this is a sign that that's definitely not going to be the case. And there's just for years, the sort of anti-smoking lobby drape themselves in a lot of very disingenuous arguments. This is entirely about secondhand smoke, for instance, which didn't even make sense for the original smoking bans. They also banned it on like open air train platforms and wouldn't allow workmen to smoke in their own transit vans, even if they're alone. Like, it was obviously towards just paternalism. But again, the health arguments, what possible risk are you to someone to be within a few feet of them in the outdoors in a beer garden? It's not even negligible, it's non-existent. And yet they're still making these cases. But increasingly, this is clearly just about what these policies are always about, which is just pushing people around and imposing the tastes of the most miserable people in society on everyone else.
Yeah.
Like this idea that everyone just wants to live as long and as healthy a life as possible, and that you're absolutely mad if you would possibly prioritize pleasure to a certain degree. It just doesn't compute with the people who are setting these policies, unfortunately. And it's a sign of things to come. I mean, the fact that we're open, it's just a matter of course that we're going to usher in the total prohibition of cigarettes, despite prohibition being such a dreadful policy historically, and that's just common sense, apparently.
And there'll be no pushback.
Mad.
There'll be no pushback, even from the Conservatives. Let's face it. It feels like as soon as if they announce it, it's a done deal, pretty much. Unfortunately.
And I do think, just listening to the discussion today, so much of it is about a general disgust with people's life choices. So you hear people saying, well, I don't want to sit in a pub garden when someone's smoking next to me. It's going to ruin my lunch. And you sort of think, well, you're living in a democracy and in a country where we have freedom to do. And I just think so much of this is about people's expression of distaste with smoking and with disgust at smoking and people's life choices. And, that's not what the law is for. It's not for sending messages to people about how disgusting they are.
It is just, aside from anything else, the health arguments being nonsense, the economic arguments being nonsense. These arguments about the NHS as well are complete. Like the idea that the biggest drain on the NHS is people who die earlier is absurd. Like there's plenty of evidence to show that actually it's non-smokers who tend to cost the state more over time for kind of obvious reasons. But it's also just how miserable it is, and the kind of culture that we're losing by letting these things just move through. Like just a country of genuine sort of live and let live, of not being so health obsessed, of not being so myopically focused as a government on policing the minutiae of people's lives, and actually maybe try and take on some of the bigger problems that confront us on the political level, on the cultural level, everything. It just shows how kind of rotten and intolerant things have become so quickly.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.